Tonight at 10, another 2 energy suppliers go out of business, victims of the sharp rise in the cost of gas. The firms are Green Supplier and Avro Energy, with 800,000 customers between them, making 6 company closures in the past fortnight. As the price of gas continues to rock the industry, the regulator warns there could be worse to come.
We are in unprecedented cost territory, and I'm afraid, there are many factors that have contributed to that. So it's very hard to predict how long that will last.
We'll be looking at the continued impact of a 6-fold rise in wholesale gas prices since last year. Also tonight, at the White House, Boris Johnson gets a clear message that a free trade deal with the US will not be happening anytime soon. We report from India, where the economy is still heavily dependent on coal as the pressure grows to move away from fossil fuels. And it could be the beginning of the end of compulsory seating for football fans in the top divisions.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, a big night of EFL Cup action. West Ham get another crack at Manchester United. Can they get revenge for their weekend defeat?
Good evening. Another 2 energy suppliers have gone out of business, the latest victims of the crisis caused by the huge increase in the cost of gas. The firms are Green Supplier and Avro Energy, with 800,000 customers between them. All affected consumers will continue to receive energy, while a new supplier is appointed by the regulator Ofgem, which warned today that more firms were set to close, potentially affecting millions of other customers. Bulb, which is the UK's 6th largest energy company with 1.7 million customers, says it's already looking at its financial options. Our business correspondent, Coletta Smith, has the latest details.
2 more energy firms have collapsed. As Avro and Green call in the administrators, that clocks up a total of 6 energy companies folding within the last fortnight. The industry called for help, but the government says they won't bail out suppliers in trouble.
In the first instance, the industry has to look to itself. And as you said at the beginning of your question, where I stand in these issues. I do not believe that it is responsible government to put taxpayers' money to companies that are run. So that means that I don't think we should be rewarding failure.
We're now seeing the result of that decision, with a number of other providers teetering on the brink. More than 1 million customers are now being switched to a new provider, but they're facing the prospect of being charged more.
It did make me think to have a look around. It's a bit of a worry, and it means that we have to think about our budgets.
Robert was with a supplier who went bust a few months ago, so he was automatically transferred.
I just think it's shocking that a lot of people on probably relatively low incomes, it's going to be such a big factor over the winter.
Those being moved to a new supplier may be charged at a higher rate, which Sarah doesn't think is fair.
It would be better if they did alternative plans or caps. Nobody wants the energy prices going up, do they? So don't really try and think about it much, otherwise it would probably stress me out.
There's no comfort for customers from the regulator. They think it's likely that more firms could collapse in the coming weeks.
We are in unprecedented cost territory, and I'm afraid, there are many factors that have contributed to that, including an increased international demand, potentially some restrictions around supply. So it's very hard to predict how long that will last.
One corner of this crisis has been fixed for now. The government's paid to restart carbon dioxide production for the food and drinks industry. But the underlying problem of expensive gas isn't going away anytime soon. Most of us will see energy bills rise in the next couple of weeks, no matter who your provider. And it comes just as the autumn weather is turning and we're going to need to flick on our heating more often. So it is going to be an expensive winter ahead. Energy bosses say the situation is out of their hands.
The real worry is that the sector is so fragile as a whole that players that might be expected to pick up customers are worried about doing so because of the cost of doing it. There's no cash down the back of the sofa anywhere.
So the government will have to plug that gap and may pay loans to the remaining companies to convince them to accept the 1 million customers now in flux, as the gas price spike claims more companies. Coletta Smith, BBC News.
A proportion of the rise in wholesale gas prices paid by the energy companies will eventually feed through to the food and energy bills paid by the consumer. And factoring in the tax increases already in the pipeline and the planned reduction in universal credit, the pressure on household finances is set to increase in the coming months. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth reports from Stoke-on-Trent.
At this community garden, they care about health and well-being. Families and volunteers growing fresh food, particularly useful, perhaps, given there is worry about prices.
At the weekly shop, it's gone up about £15 to £25 a week. You just have to cut costs other places, don't you, like rob Peter to pay Paul.
People here say they are managing, but talk of rising bills is causing concern.
At my age, I shouldn't really be worrying about the cost of a shower. I don't think it will be on Boris's agenda to look at his thermostat, will it, when he goes home at night?
It is terrifying going into winter and not knowing how much fuel prices are going to rise and how much inflation might affect mortgage rates and things.
Still famous for its pottery, Stoke-on-Trent was an industrial hub that has faced economic struggle. One local MP who was in Westminster today told me she's worried about a tough winter, but hopes it will be short-lived as the economy picks up post-pandemic.
I'm upbeat about the future for the city, but in the meantime, we will undoubtedly have a few tough months ahead. I'm confident for the most vulnerable that there will be help available.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This is, though, fast becoming a political battle line, with Labour claiming families face a perfect storm.
Universal credit down £1,000, rent up £150, gas bills up £150.
The government points to measures to help, including a cap on energy prices.
We're providing seasonal cold weather payments to eligible claimants, an extra £25 a week during colder periods. On top of that, we're giving a winter fuel payment to recipients of the state pension. But the crucial thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we've got rising employment and rising wages, and that will benefit everyone in Scotland and across the UK.
Back in Stoke-on-Trent, the economy is clearly moving again. The government did put billions of pounds of support in place during the pandemic, which it says can't keep going indefinitely. The problem is some of that's being withdrawn just as households are facing higher bills. And even some Conservative MPs are worried about the consequences if people feel worse off. Carol's one of those set to lose £20 a week from her universal credit payments, something she's relied on since her husband Alan died in April.
Why should you, in this day and age, when you've worked hard all your life, have to sit in your living room with blinking cardigans, coats and blankets around your shoulders because you can't afford to keep warm? It's not on, it's not right.
Carol says her network of family and friends will keep her going. The question, what's the personal price and political cost if others end up struggling? Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.
A free trade deal between the United Kingdom and the United States, widely touted as one of the potential benefits of Brexit, will not be happening anytime soon, based on President Biden's latest remarks. But Boris Johnson, who held talks with the President at the White House, insisted there was every prospect of a major agreement in the future, although the focus for now was on practical steps, as he put it, to help British exporters. Tonight, Mr Johnson will be addressing the UN General Assembly in New York, from where our political editor Laura Kuensberg reports now.
The most solemn dedication of the pact that spans the Atlantic. Lives lost side by side. Memories fade, maybe. But what shape does a 21st century relationship take?
Ask him the question.
It does not now, mean a trade deal, promised when a very different president sat in that cream armchair. The White House dangles cooperation, but a big pact is not in sight.
Well, we're going to talk about trade a little bit today, and we're going to have to work that through.
On Capitol Hill this morning, there seemed more interest in awkward questions about royal spats.
Very much. And on your question about the royal family, I get a free pass on that one.
A swerve. Relations seemed friendly, but all the hand-holding in the world won't make a trade deal come any faster. Ministers have even been considering trying to pursue trade ties through different routes.
What we're wanting to do is make solid incremental steps on trade. The Biden administration is not doing free trade deals around the world right now, but I've got absolutely every confidence that a great deal is there to be done, and there are plenty of people in that building behind me who certainly want to do well.
Downing Street maintains the relationship's made great strides forwards, but the disappearing trade deal has been noticed at home.
Can I begin by offering my commiserations to the Prime Minister after he flew away to the US and made absolutely zero progress on the trade deal that he promised us.
Yeah. British hopes of a quick trade deal with the United States had already faded, but this visit has confirmed it simply isn't a priority for this White House. But Boris Johnson will leave the United States tonight, still confident this frantic few days has been worth it. There's been progress on security and particularly on climate, persuading the United States to put more money towards tackling climate change. And that's a message Boris Johnson will hammer again in New York at the United Nations tonight.
In that effort, the UK seems to have the US in its corner. The relationship between a Prime Minister and a President, central to any government. A partnership that can disappoint or delight, but always defines.
Let's go live to New York, and Laura is there. So, Laura, Prime Minister and President didn't really see eye to eye on trade, but they did apparently see eye to eye on the way the French have responded to the recent defence deal.
That's right. Our viewers will remember a really big moment when the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia announced they would share nuclear technology not so long ago, and it provoked French outrage because it meant they would lose a contract with Australia to build submarines, and also as an important military ally, they felt they'd been kept in the dark. Now, Boris Johnson told us tonight that he and Joe Biden had been taken aback by the extent of the French reaction. We understand they shared their astonishment in their talks in the Oval Office yesterday. And while they want to smooth things over with France, they also agreed it's not really the right thing to invite France to try to join that security pact as a solution. But for Downing Street, diplomatic spat aside, and whether or not Boris Johnson will have riled the French further today by suggesting in franglais that they give him a break, for Downing Street, it's important evidence that while Joe Biden and Boris Johnson may be very different politicians, they can get business done together, particularly on security and particularly also on climate change. You know, at the beginning of this trip, Boris Johnson came here giving himself only a 6 out of 10 chance that he'd be able to get the money together to help tackle climate change in time for the next important international shindig, the Climate COP conference in Glasgow at the end of next month. But Joe Biden yesterday put his hand in America's wallet and promised billions extra. And for Downing Street, that really, really is a big moment. Despite the heavy pause on a trade deal that's now very obvious, they go home tonight thinking that this week has been a diplomatic success.
Laura, many thanks again. Laura there with the latest for us in New York. Let's stay on that trade theme, because nowhere has a trade deal between Britain and America been more keenly awaited than in the city of Liverpool, the traditional gateway for transatlantic trade. The port is already wrestling with challenges posed by the pandemic and by Brexit. Our economics editor Faisal Islam reports now from Merseyside.
A cargo vessel on its way to New York from Liverpool. The docks on the Mersey have been the gateway for transatlantic trade for centuries, even before the USA actually existed. At this port, there's been some hope of a return to a golden age on this trade route.
It looks like there isn't going to be a free trade deal, but Liverpool has always been a strong trading partner with the US. And actually, with the Liverpool free port that we have coming up, that probably gives us the chance to exploit that trade flow even further in the months ahead.
So it would be better if that free trade deal could be done with America. It wasn't that the whole point of Brexit to do a deal like that?
I think free trade deals obviously are the best way for our countries to trade with each other without barriers being in place. However, that's not how the world works.
Well, there have been US concerns about Britain keeping to Brexit commitments on new checks just here in the Irish Sea. President Biden's not so keen on doing new trade deals anywhere right now. A free trade deal with the USA was supposed to be one of the most coveted prizes of post-Brexit global Britain. Doesn't look like it's going to happen for years now. And right now, the focus of most is on the crisis and some of the basics of world trade. The pandemic has gummed up the flow of goods from China at the most sensitive time, says this retailer.
We've got a lot of
Christmas products made in China. Our suppliers have them ready for them in their warehouse, and we're having issues trying to ship all those products over to the UK. And to get that additional space, we're shipping on charter vessels, because our main aim is to save Christmas.
From this spot, you can see the multi-level crisis in global trade, from the ships coming in and having to queue up at ports around the world, to the containers stacked up, staying in ports for longer, and then when they are collected, there's a big shortage in hauliers to get them around the country. All of this adding cost into supply chains, helping lead to inflation and also concerns about availability of goods. Freight specialists here are now chartering trains, even for the 80 miles to Birmingham, because they can't find hauliers.
For this to happen all at the same time, as we say, it's the perfect storm. The pandemic was the major factor, and then Brexit really just compounded the facts at the start of this year.
Vital exports will continue across the Atlantic even with no deal, but for months to come, trade problems will add to the prices customers pay. Solving that is the priority. Faisal Islam, BBC News in Liverpool.
Let's turn now to the latest on the pandemic and the official figures for the UK, which show there were nearly 34,500 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means in the past week there was an average of 31,635 cases per day. There were just over 7,500 people in hospital with COVID. Then that's another 166 deaths being recorded. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test, taking the average number per day in the past week to 139. And moving on to vaccinations, just under 90% of people aged 16 or over in the UK have had the first jab, while 82% are now double vaccinated. President Biden is asking world leaders to pledge to vaccinate 70% of the world's population against COVID-19 by September next year. During a virtual meeting, he said that the US would buy an additional 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine to donate to less wealthy countries. But the latest research shows that richer nations still have a surplus of vaccines, some of which will soon be out of date. Our health editor Huw Pym has more details.
Wealthier nations are pushing on with booster jabs, but it's a different story in low-income countries in Africa and around the world, where vaccination rates are much lower. That divergence has been criticised by the World Health Organization, and there have been growing calls for more vaccine doses to be diverted to those most in need.
They were going to come together and they were going to attack the problem.
A leading advocate for vaccine supplies to Africa said action was needed by the richest nations.
Promises do not translate into vaccines and jabs in people's arms. Commitments are not jabs in people's arms. People are dying for want of a vaccine. I spoke at the WHO meeting, and that same day a member of my household had just died, a 30-year-old woman, because she was unvaccinated.
New research suggests that by the end of this year, there'll be around 1 billion surplus vaccine doses in the G7 group of the wealthiest nations, including the UK and the European Union. Of those, around 100 million doses will be past their use-by date by December. As of now, estimates vary, but it's thought that only around 3% of the population of Africa have been fully vaccinated.
That's simple waste. People hate waste. Lives could be saved as a result of having these vaccines for there to be hundreds.
The former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, now WHO Ambassador for Health Financing, says shifting vaccines is in everyone's interest.
If the disease spreads in Africa and in low-income countries, and if it mutates and there are new variants, it's going to come back to haunt even the fully vaccinated here. Nobody's safe until everybody's safe.
The G7 summit in Cornwall in June pledged 1 billion doses to poor countries as a big step towards vaccinating the world, but critics say the process has moved too slowly. Today, President Biden at a COVID-19 virtual summit promised to double the US contribution.
This is a global tragedy, and we're not going to solve this crisis with half measures or middle-of-the-road ambitions. We need to go big.
But will a pledge to go big actually deliver? African countries and others will want to see vaccine supplies arriving at a faster rate before passing judgment. Huw Pym, BBC News.
In just over 5 weeks' time, Glasgow will be hosting the global climate conference known as COP26, and one of its goals will be to persuade industrialised nations to phase out their dependence on coal. China has now promised to stop funding coal-fired power projects abroad, but many economies around the world are still dependent on it. India, for example, is still building new coal-fired facilities. So how do developing nations satisfy their demand for energy while trying to curb emissions? Our correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan, reports from the East Indian state of Odisha.
India's coal belt helps power this vast nation. More than 2/3 of the country's energy production still depends on it.
Such is the demand that the country's planning on building or expanding dozens of mines in the coming years, and also continues to import coal.
There's pressure on India to reduce its emissions, but cutting coal use is a tricky balance. A major pollutant in the country, the dirtiest of fuels, coal is also a major source of jobs in these communities, which are some of India's poorest.
India cannot live without coal. Our country is a developing country. Coal is one of the major resources for Indians. If we stop the coal production under the pressure of the world community, then how can we maintain our livelihood?
And how can India meet the energy needs of a population of more than 1.3 billion? A growing middle class is driving that demand, although the average Indian still uses far less energy than the average Brit or American. India is already shifting to cleaner sources like solar. Experts say the country needs more investment to make the switch to renewables.
India has already set out some of the most aggressive renewable energy targets in the world. The more rapidly we can get more investment, more capital, more money into solar, wind, bioenergy and so forth, the quicker we can keep shifting away from the older energy infrastructure.
But making that shift means reaching communities like these, where the oldest and most basic forms of energy are the only option. Jamuna is one of the tens of millions of Indians who still don't have access to power. There's no electricity, there's no water. If we don't have coal, we can't cook. If it's harmful, what can we do about it? She tells me. We have no other option. At night, we burn coal and keep it in the house, so we also have some light. What people here want so badly is what so many in the West have long taken for granted. In India, progress comes at a price. It means cutting the cord with coal could take time. Rajini Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Orissa.
A 31-year-old man has appeared before magistrates in Derby, charged with the murders of 3 children and a woman. Their bodies were found at a house in Killamarsh near Sheffield on Sunday. Damien Bendel was remanded in custody and will appear at Derby Crown Court on Friday. Protesters who have blocked the M25 now risk going to jail. A High Court injunction came into force today after members of the Insulate Britain group brought traffic to a standstill on the motorway 5 times in just over a week. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has paid tribute to a primary school teacher who was found dead in a park in Greenwich in South East London last Saturday. Police say that Sabina Nessa, who was 28 and from Kidbrooke, had been murdered. Our correspondent Lauren Moss has this report.
A community in shock at the death of another young woman on the streets of London. Sabina Nessa's body was discovered in Cater Park in Kidbrooke on Saturday afternoon. Members of her family came to lay flowers and remember the primary school teacher they say had a beautiful soul.
She honestly was the most caring person, kindest, sweetest girl you can meet. Sabina's heart was as good as gold. She'd never have a bad thing to say about anyone. Her sisters are going to miss her so much.
Detectives believe Sabina was attacked almost 24 hours before her body was found, at 8:30 on Friday night, minutes from her home. A post-mortem examination was inconclusive. Police and Sabina's family are appealing for anyone with information to come forward.
For the sake of humanity, for the sake of, women, children, daughters, sisters, this is a heinous crime.
A man in his 40s arrested on suspicion of murder has been released pending further inquiries. Police met with residents today who are concerned for their own safety. Patrols will be stepped up as the investigation continues. Lauren Moss, BBC News.
From January, some football supporters will be able to stand at Premier League and Championship games. As part of a pilot scheme, it will be the first time that fans won't have to sit for these big matches since the reforms that followed the Hillsborough disaster back in 1989. Our correspondent Laura Scott has more details.
For more than 25 years, a blanket ban on standing at football matches has been in place in the top 2 divisions in England and Wales. The reality, though, is that persistent standing has become a common sight at grounds. While Premier League club bosses met today, the significant but seemingly surprising announcement came of a trial of safe standing.
What do you think of safe standing?
Great, it's brilliant.
Terrific idea.
Would you be in favour of being an early adopter at Aston Villa?
Yes, I might be.
Premier League and Championship clubs have been invited to sign up to pilots beginning in January. Campaigners called this a vital step.
For us, today is an outbreak of common sense. It's a real step forward and a return to the way that things should have been.
Many leading clubs have been future-proofing their stadia in anticipation of a change to the legislation. Chelsea, for example, recently introduced rail seating in a couple of their stands. But what do fans think of this emotive subject?
I think it's a really good idea. I used to stand at football games quite a lot when I was younger, so I think now it's quite a good thing to have the options of stand or sit down.
We can see, and the atmosphere is better. We love it. We love the idea.
The existing policy mandating all-seater stadia was introduced in 1994 following the Hillsborough disaster, which led to the deaths of 97 Liverpool fans. Louise, whose brother Andrew was one of the victims, said she supported the move.
There are a few things I'm a little bit concerned about, but ultimately I'm very, very pleased, and I just want every football fan to be safe. That's my priority.
Several clubs have already expressed a desire to engage with the trials. If they go well, there could be lasting change on the horizon. Laura Scott, BBC News.
And that's it from us tonight. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.